Humans alter the hydrological cycle primarily one of two ways with terrestrial water or fresh water. The first one being mining aquifers or drilling wells and extracting the water within the rock layers beneath the well site. Now, when most people think about wells and water wells, we imagine a lake under the surface of the earth. And although there are some places where there are large cavities that house water, for the most part, there are virtually few and far of those between. The rock that houses water is usually very tight. Often it's limestone or other sedimentary rock, often even volcanous rock that has pore spaces or voids within it in which water then can penetrate and then be housed. So the larger the rock structure that has this porous or void spaces, the greater the potential of moisture holding capacity that rock has. So in the United States, there are several significantly large aquifers, which are the rock sources for which water is housed, as you can see from the illustrations on this slide. The largest of which is the Ogallala Aquifer that's encircled in black that sits smack dab in the middle of the United States. The Ogallala Aquifer is an ancient water source. It takes about 6,000 years for water to fill that aquifer up. So we've got really almost fossil water here. Some of the water that's in there is much older than 6,000 years old. That means that it takes 6,000 years to replenish the water which has left that aquifer. Since World War II, we've been extracting water at a significantly high rate from the Ogallala Aquifer, and there are places in the Ogallala now which are at a significant loss of water, and those locations, as you can see in the bottom diagram on this slide, are housed primarily within Kansas, a little bit in Colorado. New Mexico has significantly large portions that have lost water, and including the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas, all have areas of very high water loss. There's a couple of places in the Ogallala where we've seen an increase of water, which is unusual. That being the eastern part of Nebraska and actually the Permian Basin within Texas. The water which is being extracted at these locations, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oklahoma for the most part, it contributes significantly to the local, regional, and state economy. So with the loss of water in these areas, what we're going to see is a loss of revenue for these locations. That revenue is primarily coming as agriculture and agricultural crops. If those crops, which have become dependent on water over the last more than half century now, no longer exists, then we not only lose a significant portion of the economies from these places, but the United States, which depends on cheap food that's produced from these regions, now is going to struggle for those food resources. So it's a significant loss. Now that's discussing the Ogallala and the significance there. We've got other aquifers, as you can see from the map, that have also great opportunity to furnish agricultural activities across the United States, but none as significant as the Ogallala Aquifer. The second way that humans have significantly altered their hydrological cycle through terrestrial water extraction or modification is through diverting waters and streams through dams, dikes, levees, and the like. And this is a really ancient form of diversion. When we became agrarians about 10,000 years ago, one of the significant technological innovations was to move water from plentiful locations to sparse locations where crops had been established. This diversion, like water mining in the Ogallala and other aquifers, allowed places that weren't sufficiently producing foods for the numbers of people and for trade and things like that, historically allowed that to bloom, and major economies started to then manifest out of this. Most of our significantly large water diversion projects are in the United States, are in the western part of the United States, but that does not preclude the fact that there are significantly large numbers of medium to small water diversion conditions in the eastern part of the United States. A couple of those water diversion projects and water impounding projects in our area include the small diversion project up with Mosquito Creek and Mosquito Lake. Girard Lakes is a small consideration. A little larger in scale is the Meander Reservoir. We're using that water both for water consumption, drinking water, as well as agricultural water. In the United States to the west, we're seeing far larger plots of land being used for in agriculture with this diversion, but we're also supplying major urban centers like Phoenix and Los Angeles, San Diego with water diversion projects. What's highlighted on the screen here is part of something called the Central Arizona Project, and the Central Arizona Project is just one example of how significantly large these diversion projects have become. And so we've dammed up large components of the Colorado River, and in doing so, impounding that water in Lake Mead and other lakes across the river that used to run into the Gulf of California, now move that water across the arid landscape of Arizona. And in doing so, we're exposing that water to larger durations of potential evapotranspiration, which is then going to then increase the humidity in these areas and change local and regional climates to some degree. But we're also putting that water on these landscapes, which then can evaporate. And what ends up happening out of that is we draw salt and other minerals out of the soil, in effect then creating sort of a crust, a salty crust on the top of the water, and really reducing to negating the agricultural potential that is trying to be gained in these areas. The second diagram in this illustration is two satellite images of the Yuma Irrigation District, which is part of the Central Arizona Project. The cyan and red satellite image is showing the degree of which we've got healthy crop production, and that's illustrated in red. The cyan color is telling us where there is a loss or little to no vegetation in this area. So you can see the very clear delineation from natural landscapes to the northwest and the southeast, to then urban centers where there's very little agriculture, and then some infusions of the desert into that irrigation district. When we talk about soil water budgets, how much water is in the soil, what we're looking at is a ratio of how much moisture is put into that soil through various means of precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, dew, and how much is actually extracted from that landscape through evaporation and evapotranspiration, or the outward movement of water from plants through their stoma. The balance between how much precipitation is retained in the soil versus how much is extracted is how much is budgeted for the plants themselves. So this becomes a really important characteristic. The big rate at which soil water budgets are maintained or calculated is through what the temperatures are and the humidity, but we can't also negate how much water is precipitated through here, and maybe what the soil holding capacity is of that water. The plants, when the temperatures are high, are going to respirate more greatly, which means they're going to use more water, which means the budget is going to drop. So as seasons change and as we've seen a trend in warming over the last several decades, what used to be sufficient water in the soil water budget at one time is no longer sufficient because the plants need to work harder to maintain the water within their own systems. With soil water budgets, we calculate, or the agronomist and the farmer calculates, a deficit of water when there is not enough water available that is required by the plants. Now, this is a human condition and this is an agricultural calculation. Nature doesn't have water deficits. The ecosystem responds to that, and whether we like it or not, an ecosystem can be lost to a deficit of water. Given enough time, it could be geologic time, an ecosystem will return, but for the most part, the system doesn't see a deficit or not. So this is really just the purview of how humans understand soil moisture budgets. When there is a surplus, that means that there is more water available than the soil can hold and the plants can use. This generally results in flooding, and flooding of an area is just as harmful as water deficit environments. Those plants that stand in water can see significant losses. And climate change, as much as we often think about a dry landscape and the loss of crops with an arid environment under climate change, we also know that there are going to be areas that are going to have surplus water environments, and Ohio is one of those areas where we should be seeing a bump in water. That means that farmers and agronomists in the state are going to have to invest in ways to pump water out of some places that are going to result in standing water where the crops can no longer maintain a healthy environment where there's more water than they can use. This could also mean changing crop types. And 40 years ago, people already started talking about maybe moving crops like rice into parts of Ohio and parts of Pennsylvania, because we're going to see an increase in soil moisture. And standing water is one of the conditions that is appropriate for rice production.